few questions and then I'll open it up for, you want to sit down?
Sure, I'm just gonna,
You want some water?
thank you.
You have water?
Yeah, I have water. Mhm.
So, the first question is related to, you said that you offered some therapeutic, opportunity for the people who participated. How many women, actually took advantage of that?
That's a great question, thank you for that. Only one did. However, I would like to say that the reason why some of the others didn't, they were very thankful for the opportunity, but they said that they were going to utilize their own therapy. You know, they said, I haven't been to my therapist in such a long time, I have this service, and I'm gonna go ahead and start that back up.
Okay. So you mentioned, the daddy issue, you said something about daddy's issues and there being a gender bias. Can you explain that to us a little bit more?
Surely. Typically when we hear, and again, like I said, daddy issues is generally used in pop culture, you know, so we hear it in TV shows and in everyday conversations, but it's usually a label that is attached to women who are exhibiting certain behaviors. So she could be needy, or she could be aggressive, multiple marriages, relationships. So those sorts of challenges are said to be a result of daddy issues.
Okay. So, did your findings with the population of women you looked at, did it correlate with what the literature said related to African American women and fatherlessness?
Well, the literature regarding African American women and fatherlessness is scant at best. So I just had to make inferences.
Okay. So that's another study that is worth doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, you mentioned that attachment theory was influenced by culture. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
Absolutely. I will use the example of one of my participants. Her father died when she was a young adult, and he was living in Jamaica at the time. And in Jamaican culture, when someone dies, we have what's called a night, which is a wake, okay? And so the purpose of the night and a wake, as you all know, is where the family comes together and the community comes together. And so she experienced internal conflict because she didn't have a relationship with her father, but yet still she felt obligated to participate in this familial activity and this event. And so that attachment and struggling with her relationship with her half-siblings, I mean, she had all sorts of conflicting and crazy emotions as a result of that one particular cultural experience.
Okay. So you would say that the attachment theoretical perspective, just in and of itself, gives space for people from various cultural backgrounds?
Absolutely. Yes, it does. Yes. So from a strengths-based perspective, that allows us to look at the individual's culture and be able to identify what is significant to them, what's important to them, and to raise that as a matter of priority. And it will also help us to be able to better understand how attachment intersects with those particular elements.
So you made mention of some potential participants didn't feel comfortable with the study based on some of the terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak about that a little? And also, I guess even more than that, interested in if you thought through some alternative approach to still being able to, like if you were doing another study, capturing a population of people who may not be able to identify because of however that's making them feel, but that they still would be good participants in a study. So does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense,
okay.
Actually.
Okay.
And I think that there would be a richness to interviewing those types of participants who were initially resistant, because then we would really be able to explore those emotions that they had with respect to their fatherlessness.
Because these were people who were in fact fatherless, but because you're using the term fatherless, they were having, so can you give us an example of something that somebody may have said?
Absolutely. So when I had the conversation with her, she said, so wait, what do you mean? I have to say it the exact way she said it. What do you mean fatherless? I have a father. And I said, yes, biologically, everybody does have a father, but what we're looking at for this study is, the individual was not in the same house as their father, or their father was completely absent. And she said, well, I knew where he was, so I'm not really fatherless. So she was angry. And so at that point, I didn't want to become a social worker. I just wanted to remain as a researcher.
Right.
And I said, okay, well, if you want to give it some thought and follow up with me, then, we can consider moving forward, but I'll leave the ball in your court.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So, I think I have one last question. I'll save that one till later. Okay. That's it for now.
Okay.
Dr. Daugherty?
All right, I'm gonna follow up on something that Dr. Wilborn talked about your understanding of attachment theory as something that might be universal, right? So that there's people from different cultures, and that it is accommodating enough about the issues of culture that could be used. So the next step, okay, if the theory can accommodate different cultures, did you find any literature that said that the scale that you used was normed on populations, on different cultures and different populations?
No, I did not.
Isn't that interesting?
And I tell you that I was very deliberate about that, but I didn't find anything.
Isn't that amazing? So when we're thinking, thinking through and trying to figure out, what's going on with this kind of situation, one of the things that people might say is, well, you used an instrument, right? Why did you do a qualitative study? Why didn't you just develop a scale and send it out to 1 million people? Then you'd have some good chi-squares, maybe, some really good statistics.
Chi-squares.
Okay. Why did you use IPA?
I used IPA because I was interested in the lived experiences. I wanted to be able to be taken into that space with my participants to really hear their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, their reflections even. Through some of my interviews, the participants, they would pause. And I paused with them. I allowed them that time. I didn't want to rush them through this process. And so I think that IPA honors a very, it's a difficult experience, but it honors their willingness to participate in the study. And so that's why I chose this one.
If you had done a scale, do you think you would have had the same results or same findings?
I think I'd have had different findings. And I think, well, you didn't ask me that, so.
Well,
I think
I want to know what you think.
I think that a mixed methods study would be appropriate, to your point, because the statistical side of this is necessary, especially when we're talking about trying to revamp policy, but it definitely needs that qualitative approach.
So I was really interested in your reporting about your reflexive journals. Can you say more about that? What did you notice in the journals during this process that surprised you? Or, sort of you were like, oh, gee, I didn't realize this was going on.
With myself,
or just what you saw
with
when you reviewed
as well,
anything.
there was a lot. It's interesting because I found that I was intrigued by the fact that these participants, they were educated, and I wondered about did their level of education in any way impact their attachment? And because some of them were able to sort of just accept the fact that, okay, so my father was absent. So I was like, well, what contributed to that? And I definitely made note of that in my journal. because, you know, we didn't speak about that in the interviews, but I was definitely very curious about that.
All right, turn it over to Dr.
I loved your reference to co-researchers. I like that. It shows a level of regard and balances the playing field. And I like that, so I wanted to acknowledge that. Gonna push you maybe just a little bit to think about the connection with the literature. Mind you, most of my questions haven't been asked, but I want to go back to Dr. Williams' question about the literature. And while there's little literature that exists on African American, this topic, how can you relate your study to what has been produced about motherlessness? Maybe you said there's data on motherlessness, but very little on fatherlessness. Is when you look back and you think back, is there a comparison? Are there similarities in the findings?
First of all, that's an excellent question, especially because of the fact that, as I stated, when parental absence initially became under study, under investigation, the emphasis was on maternal absence. And so, yes, there are similarities. I think that where the divergence happens is the manifestation and what that looks like. So yes, there may be, whatever emotional or self-esteem, in that individual. But how is it manifested? What are the behaviors that are typical when there's mother absence versus father absence? And also, important for this particular study, one of my participants, she actually was both motherless and fatherless. Okay, and she was actually the participant that was insecure, ambivalent.
That may be something for you to look at further. I was interested also in your the categorization of each of your 14 participants. Did they choose the category?
No.
Okay. I wonder what category they would choose.
Right. Absolutely.
Just curious.
And so let me address that. I was fearful that if I had them to do that, that it would have prescribed their responses. I didn't want that. So I just, looked at the criterion and I really mulled over their transcripts and assigned them the appropriate attachment type.
Just curious. And this next question is just for me. I think I missed it. You mentioned earlier, it was the slide on the strong black woman, and I want to find it. But that there was a connection between daddy issues and the strong black woman. Help me with that.
Sure. So because of adversity, women are oftentimes, black women in particular, are said to be strong black women. And so fatherlessness is adversity. With respect to absentee well, I guess we can even say for any type of fatherlessness. So if the father died or whatever the case would be. So because of this father absence, for some women, they emerge as strong and they're heralded as strong black women, and they're unstoppable, and they excel in their professional world and in their academic pursuits. So that's what the connection is.
Okay, I'm gonna look through that a bit for myself. I'll come back. I know there will be a question about that.
Okay.
I'll pass.
Okay.
We're coming back on that.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So I have another question, too, actually, for now at least. Did you find any publications on journaling using IPA? Because I find that very curious. Have you seen anybody to actually write
Mhm.
about their actual journaling, because I would think that the notes and stuff from your
Mhm.
journaling would be a great
Yeah.
publication.
And actually, Dr. Daugherty and I talked about that, the fact that I definitely want to turn the journal into a publication, but I didn't find any
Yeah.
articles out there like that.
But that's interesting, because it's such an interesting piece to it all, but it also is such a foundation for practice,
Mhm.
you know, and for direct service. So I just think that that whole piece is, it's really good. And then the other thing, which to me is somewhat related, and that is, what are your thoughts? And I want you to put on your researcher hat, and then you can put on whatever other hat you want and respond as well. But I'm curious as to your thoughts from a research perspective about doing something so close to you personally. Because I know when I was in school at Howard University, you know, that was kind of a taboo to do things that are so close to you personally. And I know a lot of people still prescribe to that ideal, that you don't want to do something so close to you personally. And one of the major reasons is the ideal that people don't finish
Mhm.
because they get so emotionally, you know,
Mhm.
involved, and then they can't separate, you know. So, and that's a legitimate, you know, a legitimate reason, you know, not to do something so close to you personally. I mean, and another thing is, you know, sometimes you find yourself at war with your committee,
Mhm.
because they want you to do certain things and you want to do certain things, you know, and so there's this, you know, that kind of struggle. Of course, we didn't have any of that with you. But I would just, and part of it I think also is because you have a committee of women who allowed you a lot of space, you know, to do your own work, which I think, you know, committee members should do. But, you know, just from a research perspective, just speak to, you know, your thoughts. You know, there are other people in the room that have not gotten to this stage yet, and so they may have ideas about doing something really close to them.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that it's risky to research something that is so close to you because of the potential emotional impact. It can be very traumatic. I think that a researcher would need to really clearly outline the steps for how they intended to take care of themselves, as well as maintain the integrity of the study. So really leaning on journaling is from a research perspective, that's expected. And I think research and non-research, I would suggest self-care. So for me, I expected that this was going to be triggering in some ways, and so I started back with my therapist, you know, before I even started the study. So that helped because I had that place to be able to process, as well as my journaling. And with the journaling, like, I was able to go back to it as I was going through the process to really see, okay, so what was that like the last time when I was working with this particular participant, and do I need to be mindful of that, and how can I better prepare myself for this upcoming interview? So again, just being very intentional about the procedure that you will follow, I think is critical. And I also believe that who better to tell the story than someone who has lived it? But if you have not begun to do your own work, then you should not do the study.
Okay. Dr. Daugherty, follow-up questions?
No, I'm good with my follow-up.
Thank you.
Dr. Blake?
Something for you to consider for the future. Were there similarities among various demographic groups? Those who had master's degrees, or those who were certain ages, or those whatever your demographics were. I don't know if you looked at it, but it might.
I did, yeah, and there were some similarities.
Okay.
The one that was polar opposite were the two insecure types. Because one has a master's degree, she's actually a college educator. The other one, she hasn't finished college. So they were polar opposite in terms of their education, but there were some similarities in terms of their attachment and how they are dealing with, or not dealing with, as it were, their fatherlessness.
You noted a limitation of it being only Jamaican women.
Mm-hmm.
I would challenge you that that's not a limitation, that's actually a strength of your study. So let's shift that paradigm.
Okay.
Last thing, you talked about it in your conclusion. You didn't include forgiveness as a major theme.
That's true.
Yeah, but it is.
It is. Mm-hmm.
So in your edits, make sure that last conclusive, make
Mm-hmm.
sure that's in your theme.
Absolutely, thank you.
Because it's a strength.
Yep.
And, generational, did you see any generational? Yeah.
Yes. So actually, two of my participants were mother and daughter. And of course, I didn't discuss, the other's interview with them. But it was interesting to see the similarities between the mother and her daughter. And also, the mother, she was actually fearful because of her fatherlessness. She was fearful. She said that she was afraid that her daughters, she has two daughters, that they would end up being fatherless. And the fact that this particular child ended up fatherless, it devastated her. She felt like a failure. But that daughter, through her, actually this is the one that I talked about with the Ninite. For her, the fatherlessness, even though it was painful and traumatic, that's what really drove her to pursue higher heights.
That, I like that response, that was interesting information, but I'm more interested in knowing, if you saw some generational dynamics, like in an older generation, were
I see,
things
I'm
similar?
sorry.
Yeah,
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm.
yeah.
I did not see that.
Okay, okay, that's interesting. Okay, colleagues. Dr. Van Slyman?
I'd like to add to what Dr. Williams actually just asked, because I think that, and from a policy perspective, that if you are looking specifically at women in the Caribbean broadly, and if you're looking at Jamaica in general, then if you start looking at policy perspectives in terms of what immigration trends were, where Jamaican women, say for instance, were not allowed into Canada with their husbands, but they were allowed in as domestics.
Yes.
And therefore they were allowed in with their children, but not with their husbands. Then you might see some generational trends. And this was the 50s, and therefore their children would be in their 50s at this point.
Right.
And those women would have 20-something-year-old children at this point.
Absolutely.
So the rationale for fatherlessness might then become very, very different, as well as the immigration trends out throughout the Caribbean, where, through explorations with Marxism in the 50s, where the intelligentsia and the work and the wealthy left in the 50s, the working class left in the 70s, and sometimes the poor left in the 80s. Why people were leaving the Caribbean at that point might also be reflected in their parenting patterns.
Absolutely.
And therefore there might be some very interesting outcomes for fathering, because who's accepting men as immigrants versus who's accepting women as immigrants, and women and their children. I think that this study has come miles, beautiful miles.
Thank you.
I'm very, very happy for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But it has miles to go in terms of a body that you can work forever on. It is amazing, it's beautiful.
My question was gonna connect to Vance Lightman. Which was something to consider and look at again, the reasons for the fatherlessness, right? And were there any correlations between the reasons for the fatherlessness? Because you didn't look at death, right? You didn't.
No,
look at-
no.
Right. The reasons for the fatherlessness and the findings. So,
Dr. Darrell?
So I'm going to look at the piece around the attachment theory. Bowlby's theory grew out of what could be considered more of a cultural, nuance. He was not considering culture. His original study took place here in Baltimore. And I've never really been able to find out who was involved in that study. I've done a lot of work around trying to figure out who was he looking at.
You're referencing the 40 juveniles?
No, not the juveniles, the mothers.
Okay.
Because he did a study and it was really based around what they called the strange study.
Yes, the strange,
And it was
with Mary Ainsworth.
really focused on women, and it really spoke to proximity in terms of attachment. So that cultural piece was, I think it was safe. Okay, because you didn't identify were they white women, were they black women, were they Latino women, who were they? They were women.
Right.
And he looked at attachment as it pertained to proximity. So when we think about attachment, we think about the ability for children, particularly young children, to form a bond. And that was the focus of attachment theory, the bonding. When did that bonding happen? Who did the bonding happen with? But fathers were never included in that. That was primarily about women and their attachment and bonding with their children. I think that it would be important to use attachment theory across the spectrum with other populations to norm it, because other populations demonstrate attachment differently than Westerners versus Eastern populations versus Middle Eastern populations. The whole piece around attachment and bonding is very different, and I think that's where the cultural piece will come in. I think the question that I sat with while you were talking was, why Jamaican women? Because there is definitely a cultural piece for Caribbean women, and I'm both Jamaican and Bayesian, that there is this texture to attachment as it pertains to Caribbean people.
May I respond to that? As you shared, you are both Jamaican and Bayesian, and as you know, and Dr. Van Slightman and others who are Caribbean, the Caribbean, we are one, but we are so different. And so I felt that it was important to be able, for this study, to look at Jamaicans and then look at some of the other islands or other countries throughout Africa, or African Americans, because we do attach differently. There are some significant differences between how we do attachment.
Dr. Sinclair.
Mine's going to be brief because I think Dr. Van Slyton took all the good questions.
So was me.
But I just have a question. I know that you talked about the experience of fatherless, and you did not distinguish between death or divorce or separation. And I think that's interesting because I'm wondering if it would be different if a person would experience loss or fatherlessness differently if the father died of natural causes. I think that's something that you would want to explore in future research. But I'm also interested in reconstituted families. If a person lost their father through divorce but then gained a stepfather, they still experienced fatherlessness. Or were they still experiencing that feeling of loss?
And actually, that was present with one of my participants in particular. I don't know if you remember when I said that one of them, her stepfather sexually abused her. So that is and I like that
So
term,
maybe depending on the
reconstituted.
quality of the relationship.
Yeah.
Reconstituted because, as the research is showing that, the divorce rate among particularly people of African diaspora is somewhere 60-70%. The remarriage rate is over like 87%.
Mhm.
People do get remarried, and that changes, you know, that feeling of abandonment or loss or,
Mhm.
you know, and I'm just wondering if you want to consider that for your
Yes,
future research.
absolutely, yeah, I think that's important, thank you for that.
Other questions? Dr. Shealy?
I just have a pragmatic question. Forgive me for not being so intellectual like my colleagues. I'm at the lower level. But no, on a more, very important note, have you identified some journals that, where you can publish this study? And several journals. And have you thought about, kind of a publication, strategy? Maybe publishing a couple of findings versus some other findings. So,
That's-
publication productivity,
We'll work on that.
Absolutely, thank you.
that's very critical.
Thank you very much. I've
Right.
certainly thought about it in the global sense.
Right, right.
But I haven't specifically identified the exact journals, but I have an idea of
Okay.
which ones, but I look forward to working with
And you
you.
might be able to use some of the ones that you cited,
Yes,
as well.
definitely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
but I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Dr.
very
Sinclair?
much.
Just really quick, I know Linda and I did a presentation a couple of years ago around fatherlessness in young women. And we also received a little bit of pushback in using the word fatherlessness.
Hmm.
You know, we got that pushback
Wow.
because, again, people said, you know, everyone has a father. It's father absenteeism, you know, which will probably more accurately define.
But not necessarily, because it's not just the absence of him, sometimes he's absent when he's present.
Exactly right.
So it's hard to
Mhm.
get the right terminology
Mhm.
that people can identify with.
And I think the other piece to that is, there is a colloquial negativism that is attached to that. Excuse me,
Certainly.
mother. The bastard child,
Mhm.
the outside child,
Mhm.
particularly within Caribbean cultures. So when you speak about fatherlessness to particularly older Caribbean women, you're really treading on thin ice, and they are feeling that in a very different kind of way.
Absolutely. There was just a situation recently where my grandmother was furious with me for similar reasons. You know, my grandma is almost 90, and is Jamaican in every sense of the word, and so yes, you know, culturally, you have to consider what these words mean for these people.
But it's,
Yeah, absolutely. Can you say?
I was saying, it's the same concept with the word daddy, or daddy issues.
Yeah.
right. But it's also important in terms of, you know, breaking through whatever those barriers are, because, in terms of just giving people space to be able to talk about it. So I do think figuring out the best ways that you can, you know, open it up so that people feel comfortable, because otherwise, you know, as you know, doing the study, people just carry it.
Right.
They just carry it, you know, so I think that's one of the great things about your study, and a great thing about this, hopefully being the rest of your career work, is continuing to push the envelope to open the space up and the opportunity. And even for men, you know, eventually to be able to also, you know, African American men, Caribbean men, you know, whomever, because it is so taboo, you know. But and it's so interesting too. But we're also forgiving for whatever it is he didn't do, right? We're also forgiving for the most part. Now some people hold on, but for the
Yes.
most part, you know. So I think it's a great opportunity. I just think it's a great opportunity for research as well as for practice work, and for creating the research to support the practice work. This is a really good
Thank you.
opportunity, a great opportunity. Any other questions?
I have one, and I really enjoyed the presentation as well as all the questioning and insightfulness. But I was wondering, you spoke to the piece, I think one of the professors brought up about forgiveness that you addressed. Were any of the participants able to articulate that they actually experienced love in the absence of a father?
Yes, and that was another one of that was something that I reflected in my journal, that it was shocking. There was this compassion that, that they, two in particular that I'm thinking of, they had compassion for their fathers. Even though, you know, so much time had passed, and for one of them, they would never be able to have a relationship, but she completely forgave him and said, I love my father, even though they can't have that relationship.
Colleagues? Anything else?
Excellent job.
Okay. Well, thank you. We will convene with the